This is a video about how to play chess. My name is Ted Weinberg, and this is my capable assistant Valkyrie. And we can start off with learning the names of the pieces. So the tallest piece on the board is called the king. Usually has a little cross at the top and sits near the middle of the board. The second tallest piece is called the queen. Moves pretty fast around the board, as we'll see in a minute. Then we have the bishop. It has a hat that looks like a bishop's mitre. And then we have the knight, the rook, and a row of pawns. You notice that on the other side we have another bishop, knight, and rook, just like on the first side. And that's the names of the pieces. Lesson 2, how to set up the board. You start off by taking your queen, remember she's the one that looks like this, and you place it in front of you in the middle on the space that matches her color, right? So she would go right here, white queen on the white space. You'll notice I already have the black side set up with the black queen on the black space. You then place the king, here he is, right next to the queen. And then to the side of the king and the queen, you place the bishops. The bishops are the advisors to the king and queen, so they stand right next to him. And you have the rooks at the corners. Put the two rooks there. And then the knights go in the remaining spot between the rooks and the bishops. And finally, you place the 8 pawns across the row in front. They are the foot soldiers of the battle. And they are out in front to protect the king, queen, and their pieces behind. And then you set up the other side to match. Notice that the queen and the king are in the same file, or the same column on both sides. You don't have them reversed this way, so you don't have a king facing a queen, but you have a queen facing a queen. And you always want to have a black square on your left when you're playing. If you have a white square, that means you have the board rotated 90 degrees. So before I get into the details of how each individual piece moves, I wanted to first talk about the mechanics of taking turns and what you do on your turn. White always goes first, and on your turn, what you do is you move exactly one piece to a new location. Now there's an exception, which is where you can do a castle, which involves moving 2 pieces. I'll get to that later. But usually it's just one piece. So let's say that on his turn, white chooses to move this piece to here, right? So that's where it was originally. That's where it was moving to. And as you'll see when we talk about how pawns move in the future, that is a legal move for white. Now black can choose, say, to move this pawn to here. Now on white's turn, white could choose to move one of the other pawns, could choose to move one of these 3 pieces, they're now freed up, or move a knight, let's say, or could move, say, this pawn up to here. Alternatively, you could capture, right? So white has the option of capturing black's pawn at this point. When you capture, you move your piece into the space occupied by the opponent's piece, you then pick up the opponent's piece, you take it off the board, and you place it over to the side, where it stays for the rest of the game. It's no longer part of the game. And then it would be black's turn. Black could capture back. So let me explain how each of the pieces work next. All right, time for lesson 4. This shows how to move the pieces. So I'm going to say that it's a lot easier than it may look. There are 32 pieces on this board, but in reality there are only 6 different kinds of pieces. There's the king, the queen, rook, bishop, knight, and over here we got the pawn. Okay? So there's only 6 pieces you need to learn how they move, and then you pretty much know how all the pieces move. So I'll start off with the king. For the purposes of this demo, I'm going to use a cutout that I use that shows the places where the king can move. I'm going to use the black king to demonstrate this. I place him right here in the middle, right? So all these spaces around the king are where the king can go. He can go one space in any direction. He can't go 2 spaces, right? He can't go whee over to here. He can go to here, he can go to there, he can go to there, he can go to all the spaces around him, but he just can't go any further than that. And as I pointed out in the previous lesson, the king cannot move into a space where he's going to be under attack by another piece, right? So for example, if white had a king standing right here, then black would not be allowed to move the king to here or to there or to there, because he'd be moving too close to the other king, right? He'd be moving to a place where he could be attacked. So with white's king there, black could move the king here, 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 or here, right? But he's limited. These spaces are no longer accessible to him. And that's how the king moves. So there are two other short-range pieces. I call them short-range pieces because they go a very short distance. There's the pawn and the knight. The knight's pretty complicated, and the pawn's got some special rules to him as well. So I'm going to do the pawn first. So I've placed underneath the pawn another paper cutout that demonstrates where the pawn is allowed to go. So the pawns always start here on what's called the second rank of the board, right? It's the second row from the back, and the pawn can go forward one space, or in the first time that pawn moves in the game, it could go forward 2 spaces, but only if there's nobody in that space. The pawn can't capture going forward. If there were another pawn, say here, the pawn couldn't go forward and capture that piece. If there were a pawn here, it could go forward to there, but it couldn't go forward 2 spaces because there'd be someone blocking the way. The way that a pawn captures is on the diagonal, right? So if there's a piece standing right here, then the pawn can capture it, and take that and take it off the board. If there were a piece here, the pawn could similarly attack and take it off the board. But again, it can't attack straight forward. They only attack on the diagonals. Now, once a pawn has moved, once it's gone forward 1 space or 2 spaces in its first turn, in subsequent moves, the pawn can only go forward 1 space. And again, it only attacks on the diagonals. So if there happens to be a piece here, it can attack that way. If there happens to be a piece here, it can attack that way. But if there's a piece in front of it, it can't move straight forward. In fact, if nobody's occupying this space or that space, and somebody's right in front of it, the pawn can't move at all, right? And of course, the pawn can't go forward 2 spaces. Once it's done its first move, it only has these 3 options left. And that's how a pawn moves. Now, there's one thing very special about a pawn that's called en passant, which is French for while passing. It was a move that was introduced in the 1800s when they first introduced the idea of a pawn going forward 2 spaces. So this is where if this pawn goes forward 2 spaces in 1 turn, like that, and if there's an opponent's pawn standing on this is the 4th rank, right, across here, if there happens to be an opponent's pawn standing on either here or there on the 4th rank at the time that this guy goes forward 2 spaces, on the very next turn, this guy can choose to attack and capture him while he was passing by. 1 or 2 turns later, after that turn, he can't do it anymore. It's only the turn right after that the black pawn can choose to do an en passant and capture. It's very rare that you see en passant happen in the game, but you need to be aware of it so that you don't think you're getting by that pawn and then suddenly you have whoop, it disappears and black captures your pawn. That's en passant. So that is how a pawn moves. So the other short-range piece on the board is called the knight. And knight moves in an L pattern. He goes forward 2 spaces and over 1, right? It can be in that direction or in this direction or in this direction if there weren't a piece in the way there. And so it looks kind of like this, right? It's an L pattern. The knight is here, he can go to there. He could also, if I flip it, go from here to there, right? In fact, from a space out in the middle of the board, the knight can go to like 8 different places. In fact, I've got a cutout for this. It looks a lot like this. Boom. So when the knight is out in the middle of the board, you can go here, 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 or here, because those are all L-shaped moves away from where the knight is. Now, when a knight is near the edge, he's going to have fewer choices, right? Let's say that the knight is sitting, here on the edge of the board. The edge of the board is over here, so these spaces out here are all out of bounds, and he can't go there. So from where he's sitting, he can go to these 4 spaces, but you can't go to all 8 spaces that a knight out in the middle could go to. And similarly, if the knight were standing in the corner of the board over here, then all 6 of these are now out of bounds. There's really only 2 spaces the knight can go. So the knights are a lot more powerful when they're out here in the middle of the board, and they can control a lot more space, right? So that is how the knight moves. And one important thing I forgot to mention about the knight is that it jumps to the location it's going to. So if there were other pieces in the way, like let's say there were pawns here, a pawn here, let's say there was a king here, and let's throw in another knight over there. This knight can go to that space over here and essentially jumping over these pawns that are in between. It doesn't have to go through or have a clear path to get through. It's the only piece that does this jumping maneuver. All the rest of the pieces have to have a clear path to where they're going. Alright, so I told you there were only 6 pieces. We've already talked about the king and the knight and the pawn. So let's talk about the bishop next. Bishops move on a diagonal. So I'm going to lay out some ribbons to show you how the bishops move. Alright, so I've laid out the ribbons in an X pattern. So if the bishop is sitting on this space right here, then you can go up down this diagonal, or you can go down this diagonal. Right? So all the spaces that are touched by those orange ribbons are controlled by that bishop, or can be accessed by that bishop from where it is on the board. Now notice that when the bishop is out in the middle, it has a few more places it can go than if it is at or near a corner. Over here, for example, the bishop has only these 2 spaces and this diagonal that it can access. When the bishop's actually in the corner over here, it can only access this diagonal. There's no cross because there's going out of bounds on either side. So the bishop has more space that it can control the closer it is to the center of the board. Notice that since you have 2 bishops, you're going to have one that's always on the white spaces, because they always move on a diagonal. He never goes onto the black spaces. And you're going to have another one that's always going to be on the black spaces. Because he always goes on a diagonal, he's never going to be on a white space the entire game. Okay, so I've talked about the king, the pawn, the knight, and the bishop. Let's look at the rook. The rook moves in straight lines going up and down the board and side to side. So I'm going to put down some ribbons like that. See? So the rook can go up and down this entire file, and if there's no pieces in the way, it can go all the way down to the bottom here. And the rook can go side to side all the way across the board. Now, if there's another piece on this space that is his own piece, then of course the rook can't capture his own piece. So this piece of the ribbon would end up getting folded in, and the rook can only go down that far, right? And so the rook goes in a straight line. Notice, by the way, that when this ribbon is going across like that, an opponent's king can't cross it, right? In order for the king only gets to go 1 space per turn, and if he does that, he's at risk of getting attacked by the rook. So the king can't get across there. Now, when I showed you the bishop a moment ago, remember that the bishop can control a diagonal, but the king can cross that diagonal. He can go from here to here, and there's no space he has to occupy in between where he'd be threatened by the bishop. So the bishop's control of the board is slightly weaker than that of the rook, because the bishop has a line that can be crossed by the opponent's king, whereas the rook, the line cannot be crossed by the king. Alright, so at this point we've looked at the king, the pawn, the knight, the bishop, and the rook. Now it's time to look at the queen. The queen is the most powerful piece on the board. She can move like a rook and as a bishop. So I'm going to lay out the ribbons to show all the places where she can go. Boom! She can go a lot of different places, right? She can move on these diagonals like a bishop can, and she can move on this straight line, the file, and on the rank or the row like a rook can. So she covers a lot of territory. And because of that, she's the most valuable piece other than the king, of course. If you lose your king, you lose the game, but I'll explain that later. But she's the most maneuverable piece and the most powerful piece on the board because of what she can do. Okay, there are two other types of moves that you need to know about in chess that I haven't explained already. One is called pawn promotion. So the pawn, when it moves, it only goes forward. It never goes backwards, right? It can go a diagonal forward, but it never can go back and retreat. So if a pawn gets to the other end of the board, it's run out of spaces to go. And you'd think that'd be a bad thing, but actually it's a very good thing, because when a pawn gets to the opposite side of the board, you get to promote it. Now, when you promote it, that means that you get to place onto the board another piece of your choice. You can put in a rook, you can put in a knight, you can put in a bishop, but most often what you do is you put in a second queen, or if your queen's already been traded, you put back your queen. The queen, of course, has the power of both a rook and a bishop, so it's better to have that than to have one of these two. It's very rare that you'd put in a knight. Only if you're using it right away to checkmate the opponent's king, or have some major advantage, would you upgrade or promote a pawn to be a knight. So the pawn, of course, gets to the other side one space at a time, and sometimes you'll capture something along the way. And once he gets there, then you announce which piece you're promoting it to. Like you say, I'm promoting it to be a queen. And usually that will tip the balance in the game, and the game will end pretty quickly thereafter. It's usually pretty late in the game that pawns get all the way to the other side and get promoted. And having a queen that late in the game is a huge advantage. So you need to be aware of promoting your pawns, and you need to prevent your opponent from getting a pawn promotion. The other special kind of move is called castling. And the way that castling works is that once these guys have moved, right, the knight has moved away, the bishop has moved out like this, then there's an empty space between the king and the rook. And one time during the game, if neither the king nor the rook has moved yet, you're allowed to castle by moving two pieces at once. You move your king 2 spaces towards the rook, and you move your rook to the other side of the king. And before you touch either piece, you have to say to your opponent, I'm castling, so he knows what you're doing, and then you move both pieces. Now, if you can also castle on the other side, right? You have 2 rooks. If these 3 spaces are empty, all the pieces have moved away, and neither your king nor your rook has moved yet, you can say, I'm castling, and then move this guy 2 spaces and move the rook to the other side of the king. It's a very useful way to get your rook out into the middle of the board where he's more powerful. We'll get to that later. Now, there's some special rules about castling and when you can and when you can't. You can't castle if either your king or your rook has already moved, right? Now, if the rook on this side of the board has moved, but this one over here is not, you can still castle on this side, right? Even though that one's already moved. Once your king is moved, you can't castle on either side, no matter which rook is moved, right? Now, you also cannot castle into, out of, or through check. I haven't really talked about what check is yet, but essentially it means if there's a threat to your king anywhere along the way, you can't do it, right? So let's say that you've got pawns over here, and boom, there's an enemy rook bearing down on your king. Ooh, you're in check. You cannot castle to get out of check. You can't say, whoop, I'm castling, and move your king over to here, because you have to not be in check when you're castling. Similarly, you cannot castle through check. So see how this rook controls this file right here? So in order for the king to go from here over to here, he has to essentially go through check, and that's an illegal spot for him to be, even in passing, right? So if the king and the rook haven't moved, it still wouldn't be legal for me to castle like this, because the king would be moving through check to get there. And of course, the king cannot move into check, right? So if this opponent's rook were over here, the king couldn't go, I'm castling, and go over this way, because, whoops, I end up in check. Not a good thing. So those are the limits on how and when you can castle. And it's a very useful thing to castle, because it puts your king into the corner, either over here or over here. And usually you've got a row of pawns out protecting him in front. I've taken off a lot of the pawns to make the board look simpler here. But generally speaking, castling protects your king and allows you to move your other pieces towards your opponent's king and try to win the game. So that's castling. Okay, time for lesson 5. This is where we talk about check, what it means, and what you can do about it. So check is a condition where one person's king is being threatened by one of the opponent's pieces or pawns. So let's say, for example, we have this layout where we have a king, king, queen, and a rook, right? And let's say it's black's turn, and black moves his rook down to here. Now the rook moves in a straight line, so it is now threatening the king. So before white can take his turn, black has to say a special word when he does this. He has to say check, which announces to the white player that the king is being threatened. Now, when you're in check, you have to do one of 3 things. You either, 1, take the piece that's checking you. Aha! Like that, right? Or, that's the first thing you can do. It's usually the most fun thing to do. It's kind of like, ha, you threaten me, I threaten you back, or I take you back. You can take the piece that's checking you. Second thing you can do is you can block, right? So you could do this, move the queen between the king and the rook. So now the rook has to go through the queen to get there. And actually this is interesting because the queen is now on a diagonal with the black's king. So if white made the unfortunate choice of going here, then white would say check, because black is, for the moment, in check. Of course, what would probably happen is that black would take with this. Anyway, so you can take, right, which is probably the best move in this case. You can block, or there's a third thing you can do when you're in check, which is to move the king out of the way. So this king could go to here, but he'd still be in the crosshairs of this rook, right? King could try to go there, but no, he'd still be in check. That would be an illegal move. In fact, if white did that and said, okay, that was my move, black would have to say, that's an illegal move, and white would have to take the move back and try and figure out where to go. If you do that enough times in a tournament, then eventually you get complained to the tournament director and you get in trouble. Anyway, so when you are trying to move the king out of the way instead of taking, which is the best move here, or blocking, you have to move to a place where you won't be in check. Up here, well, you'd be too close to that king, right? Over here, you'd be too close to that king. So he can't go to either of these places, and he can't go to either of these places. So if you wanted to move the king out of the way, you'd have to go to one of these 3 spaces, right? So you could go here. That would be a legal move, not your best move, but it'd be a legal one, right? So to review, when you're in check, you got to do one of 3 things. You either take the piece that's checking you, or you block. There may be multiple ways that you can block if you have multiple pieces that are in the neighborhood, or you move the king out of the way. Now, if you're in a situation where, let's say the queen is no longer here, let's say the king is over here, and let's say this guy is here. Now, let's say black does this, boink. The rook is threatening the king, right? So he says, check. But he's actually says something a little bit different, because notice that there's no place this king can go. He's in check, but he can't go here. He's still attacked by that rook. He can't go here. He's still being attacked by that rook. He can't go here, here, or here because that's getting too close to that king. So he's in check, and he cannot make a legal move. This is called checkmate, right? That's when the game is over. White turns over his piece. The players shake hands, and you all go out and have a beer or something like that. You want to also be careful that you don't get in a situation where your opponent is not in check but cannot move. This is called a stalemate. Not good, right? So black is 1 space away from getting, let's say the king over here is be 1 space away from turning this guy into a queen, right? But if white happens to get his king right in front, like this, and it's white's turn, well, let's look. White is not in check, right? Because the pawn can't attack going straight forward, and the king is too far away. The pawn attacks on the diagonals. But so he's not in check, but he can't go anywhere. If he goes here, he's moving into check from the pawn. If he goes to here, he's moving into check from the pawn. And if he tries to take the pawn, or go here or here, he's getting too close to its opponent's king, which is illegal. This is called a stalemate. A stalemate is a tie. Both kings are down, right? And that means that white, which was in trouble here because he was behind, there's the only pieces left on the board. If there's a king and a pawn, you should be able to win. If white manages to get in front like that, it's a stalemate and it's a tie. So you have to be very careful, even when you're way ahead in the game, that you don't get into a stalemate. You got to either checkmate your opponent or always give him a place that he can move during his turn. So in the last lesson, I talked about a stalemate and how that's a tie. There are actually 4 different ways that a game can end in a tie, or a draw, as we call it. First one, I already told you about, which is a stalemate. The second form of a draw is a draw by agreement, which is actually the most common type of draw that occurs in the game of chess. And it's where, after a particular point in the game, one side decides that they're not going to be able to force a win on either side, and he'll offer his opponent a draw. And the opponent will think about it and either accept or say, no, don't want to accept the draw. If the opponent accepts, then it's a draw and the game's over. So I mentioned that there are 4 different ways to have a draw in chess. There's one, which I've already showed you, which is by stalemate, one which is by agreement. Then you have a third one, which is by repetition, and a fourth, which is 50 moves. So the repetition, I'll show a very basic example. Let's say that black, for some reason, is unaware of the fact that you can do a checkmate that way and decides to say check, like that. And white moves off to one side, and black says check again, and white comes back, check. But as soon as black comes back here, this position has been repeated 3 times. And as soon as it's been repeated 3 times, the game's over, it's a tie. And everyone goes on, right? So you don't want to have a specific repeated position 3 times, unless what you're doing is trying to get a tie. If you're way behind, sometimes you want to cause things to repeat so that you can get a tie out of the game. And of course, in this particular case, black can just go here and it's checkmate. So that's draw by repetition. The other type of draw is draw by 50 moves, meaning that if black just starts going ho-hum and flying around the board, check, and never repeats the exact same location but keeps moving around after 50 moves, then it's essentially, whoop, we have a tie game. So in the 50 move rule, in order for the 50 move count to reset, you have to have a piece be taken or a pawn to move forward. If a pawn moves or if a piece gets taken, then you're back to square one as far as counting the 50 moves. The idea being that pawns can't move forever. They're eventually going to run into the other end of the board, and that pieces can't be taken forever. And of course, if you ever get down to the point where you have just 2 kings on the board, it's automatically a tie at that point, because you can never, a king by himself can never checkmate the other king. You always need at least one other piece to do that with. So those are the different forms of how you can draw in chess. So there's one last piece to know about how to play chess, and it's called resignation. At any point in the game, either player can resign, which essentially means I quit, or I give up, or you're going to win, and I'm conceding the game. And if and when you decide that you want to resign, the way to symbolize that is to turn your king on its side, like that. And then you shake hands with your opponent, because it's always a good idea to respect your opponent, especially if it's Valkyrie, who's over there watching right now. If you see your opponent having tipped over his king like that, and if it wasn't inadvertent of accidentally bonking the king or something like that, that usually is an indication that she or he is resigning the game, and that means that you just won. Most games that don't end in a draw among the really good chess players of the world end with a resignation. It's very rare that the high-level chess matches actually make it all the way to a checkmate or all the way to a stalemate. It's almost always either a draw or one of the sides resigns, because they realize that the other person has gotten far enough ahead they're going to be able to win. And now, believe it or not, you've gone through all the lessons, and now you know how to play chess. Off you go.